Hello and welcome to the Suicide Prevention for School Staff presentation. My name is Sarah BAZEMORE. I'm the School Counseling Specialist and Student Assistance Systems Coordinator at the Virginia Department of Education. And I am joined today by Miss Betsy Bell. Betsy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Betsy Bell. I am the K-12 Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Programs Coordinator at the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety at the Department for Criminal Justice Services.
We are so appreciative of the collaborative effort that we've had with your agency and all the work that we've done around threat assessment and suicide risk assessment, and just making sure that our efforts are aligned and that we're supporting students in the best way that we can and keeping them safe. So this is a great collaborative opportunity for all of us. And I just really thank you, Betsy, for taking the time to be part of this. Martha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Martha Montgomery. I'm the school psychology specialist at the Virginia Department of Education, and welcome. So glad that you are joining us for this training. All right, so this is part one of a two-part training on suicide prevention. At the conclusion of part two, there will be a link for a survey. After completion of the survey, you will be able to download a certificate of attendance.
Just to make sure you know, that is actually a quiz too. So there are comprehension questions. So you have to score, I think it's an 80% in order to receive the certificate.
Thank you for that clarification. This training will follow the same format as our Virginia Board of Education Suicide Prevention Guidelines document. So if you've got that, or if you want to pull it up and follow along with that, you certainly may do that. And that document was adopted by our Board of Education on June 18th, 2020. So we know this training can't stand alone. Hopefully your suicide risk assessment team will spend additional time planning and collaborating on how the guidance document recommendations can be addressed within your school community and incorporated into your school division suicide prevention strategy. Part one objectives will address some common myths about suicide. We'll talk about some protective factors as well as risk factors and warning signs of youth suicide, and give you some ideas of how to respond to students that come to you in crisis. So first, we wanted to talk a little bit about these definitions. And sometimes there's confusion over some of these phrases related to suicide. So it's really important that when we're communicating with others, we're using the same language. So a suicide is the actual act of a death. Suicidal ideation is when you're thinking about potentially harming yourself through suicide, and also thinking about other suicide-related behavior. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. With suicide intent, this is when there is a certain intention, or when the person is really making that effort to end their life. And this is often expressed in ways that might be obvious, but also in ways that might not necessarily be as obvious to those around the person. And then a suicidal plan is an actual plan that a student or a person has outlining the steps in order to follow through on a suicide. That might be identifying a time, a location, and also the means of how that suicide might occur.
You know, Martha, I noticed something for the first one for suicide, that you said suicide or death by suicide, and you didn't say committed suicide. Did you want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially when we're using words. We want to be really intentional. There's been a lot of a change in how we conceptualize a death by suicide. The words committed suicide is often associated with somebody committing a crime. And what we know is when somebody dies by suicide, they're in extreme amount of pain. And so we want to not normalize the situation, but not make the person or that person's family feel like they've committed some crime in any way or are less than in this world.
Thanks for touching on that.
So let's get into some common myths about suicide. The first one is that suicide doesn't affect many people. Well, we know that this is not true. In reality, if you look at those other illnesses, cancer, heart disease, birth defects, flu, which have the flu has a lot of deaths every year, suicide makes up more than all of those combined. So suicide is certainly something that is not uncommon. It's the second leading cause of death among Virginia's students. And I believe the number is 14 to 24 of the age of young people. And so this is a very prevalent concern. In the next slide, what you'll notice is the high number of deaths. And that is, being the second leading cause, has pretty much remained stable in Virginia over many years. And so we do have a high number of deaths. But when you look at this circle, what I think is really important to notice is that 10 million, over 10 million have considered and seriously thought about suicide. So it's really important that we have those conversations to know that people aren't alone, to know that they're supported, and to be heard when we do hear things and we do have concerns. So we need to know that those children are out there and in need of support. Myth number 2 is there anything anyone can do to stop a suicide? Yeah, there absolutely is. What we know, especially with student suicide, is that a lot of times these are short-term, situational specific problems. It might be someone who's had some issues long-term, but maybe something just happened and triggered that person. But those thoughts can pass by relatively quickly. And so there are a lot of things that we want to do to make it less available of a solution for people. Suicide is a permanent solution to what is usually a temporary problem. And a lot of times people feel ambivalent and are really torn between the desire to live and the desire to die. But they really just want that emotional pain to stop. And really at that point of considering suicide, they just don't see another way out. But that's the time when treatment can be most effective. So we really want to make sure that that kids know that suicide is preventable and that there is treatment available.
There are so many student stories that we've heard and times that have been recounted to us where one staff member, one teacher, one counselor, one adult in a student's life takes the time to ask that question or step forward to offer that support, and how that just made the difference and was that turning point for that student. So I think it's so important what Martha's pointing out here, that it is preventable, but we all have to share in that role. We all have to take action steps to prevent suicide. It's a shared responsibility in every school building. And it's something that if every staff member is aware of their role and their responsibility in those prevention efforts, then student lives are saved. So I think this is just such an important myth for us to really address head on, because there are so many things that we can do to prevent it in our student population, in any population really.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's absolutely true. And you know, this kind of goes into what Sarah's saying. The myth is that most suicides happen suddenly and without warning. I can't tell you how many times there has been a death by suicide when the collective voice of that school community will come up with examples of something that they heard the student say or something that they saw the student do that made them concerned, but maybe didn't take that concern to the level of talking to the student or talking to another adult about their concern. So it's really, really important to recognize those warning signs, because a lot of times there are either verbal signs or behavioral signs that precede many suicides. So we really need to be able to learn about what the warning signs are and understand how they're associated with suicide. And a lot of times, many individuals might only show those signs to those closest to them. But sometimes they can be obvious in other ways, or not obvious, but they could be evident in other ways. They could be in their writing. A lot of times now we see it in social media. So anytime there are those concerns out there, you want to react or have some type of action to follow up on the concern.
And we're going to talk about some of those warning signs in our presentation, but I also want to share there are a lot of resources out there that are on the VDOE suicide prevention webpage around warning signs and what to be aware of. And they're great to have just on hand so that you can keep that information fresh in your mind.
So this myth is about talking about suicide, thinking that it might lead to or encourage suicide, and that certainly is not true. Many people are afraid to speak about suicide because of the stigma associated with it, and also the reaction that they might receive from others. And this is especially true in some cultures and also in some professions. But over the last year, I think it's been really fascinating that we've had more and more people really speak out about their own struggles with depression and suicidal thoughts. And so those conversations and those sort of admissions are really important to normalize the experience of depression and really having these suicidal thoughts. And also being aware that there is help out there. So we want to be able to respond to students and asking if they're suicidal will not put that idea in someone's head. Like we saw in that slide before, if you're concerned that they're having concerns about suicide, then they very likely are. And talking to someone with suicide will really show that you're concerned enough to ask, and it might give them the courage to ask for help.
We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to have that conversation and how to ask those questions, because it is such a tricky thing to do. And it's even as a trained mental health professional, when I had the opportunity to have that conversation with a student, it was difficult for me. So we're going to talk about that directly and really dive into the right way to approach the subject with students. But I think it's also important to point out that if you know that a student has been diagnosed with depression, that doesn't necessarily automatically mean they're suicidal. So they're not the same. However, we know that students that are depressed are more likely, or that's one of the warning signs, or could be part of what drives them towards suicide. But they don't always go hand in hand. So I just wanted to touch on that as well, because that can be a common misconception.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that when we get into risk factors, that's something that that we'll talk about. So the last myth is that people that attempt suicide are looking for attention. And unfortunately, sometimes we hear suicidal ideation from people more than once. And typically it is not someone looking for attention. It's because maybe they've had that feeling, that intent at one point. Maybe it subsided, or they got some intervention, they got help, and then it reoccurred. So it's very common that people have those thoughts ongoing. But a suicide attempt really means that person is suffering so deeply that they just feel helpless and hopeless. It's a desperate cry for help. And it's really not an action that should be considered as seeking attention behavior. A suicidal person is really not thinking about themselves at all, but rather they're going through a very serious mental health symptom, either due to a mental illness or a very difficult life situation. It's really important to listen to our students, acknowledge when they're in pain, listen to them, and then offer help.
When this was something that came up in the field, occasionally people said, oh, that student is just looking for attention. It might have been a parent that said that, or a colleague. My answer to them was always, if they are, they're asking for help, and we need to make sure that they get that help. So even if it is a cry for attention, it's also a cry for help. So I think we need to recognize it as that and not blow it off, right, as something that is not, and I use the words blow it off as lightly, because I don't think anybody would ever want to blow a student off or dismiss a concern. But if we just, classify it as going for attention, I think sometimes it doesn't get the support that it deserves to have.
Absolutely. And I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Bell for the next section.
Okay, so let's talk about protective factors, because they're so important when we're talking about students who are facing suicidal ideation and are having suicidal thoughts, or even having just depression or other mental disorders or illnesses. So what are protective factors and how will they help? So protective factors are those characteristics of a person or their environment that decrease the likelihood that he or she will die by suicide. It does not take away the likelihood completely, but it does decrease it. So the more protective factors that our students have and that our young people have, the less likely they are to die by suicide or to attempt suicide. So some of the protective factors that we see most often are the behavioral mental health supports. So it's really important to really lean on and utilize the mental health professionals in your school systems. So your counselors, your school psychologists, and your social workers, as well as community mental health and behavioral supports through your community services boards, through private practices, even through the pediatrician's office. And knowing how to access those. And we'll talk more about knowing how to find your community resources later, and really building those as protective factors for all of our young people. Connectedness to other individuals. So that feeling of connectedness and lack of isolation is a huge protective factor. When someone feels like they have a support system, they're less likely to feel hopeless, and they're less likely to have those suicidal ideations. The ability to cope and adapt to change and have problem-solving skills. We talk a lot about critical thinking in education, but those life coping skills are really important. Another way to frame that is resilience, and really being able to have those factors. And not everyone does. And for a lot of people, it has to be learned. So learning how to adapt to change and to build those coping skills and those problem-solving skills. Having a sense of purpose in life. So knowing that you have something out there that's for you. Involvement in sports and activities and other things in schools, in community organizations and youth groups can give young people that sense of purpose. And then again, the cultural, religious, and personal beliefs that really discourage. So a family culture that does discourage but doesn't diminish the idea of suicide. So there's a difference between discouraging and diminishing the thoughts of. So you have to be very careful when we talk about this one, that we're really talking about those cultural beliefs that discourage it for a wide array of reasons, but also if a student or a young person brings it up, that when you answer with, well, that's against our beliefs, that doesn't change how the student feels. So, so really to keep that in mind as well. But those can be very strong protective factors. Unfortunately, on the flip side, we have our risk factors and our warning signs, and that work against those protective factors. So let's take a look at what those risk factors are first. So the risk factors are the exact opposite of the protective factors. They're the characteristics of a person or environment that increases the likelihood that they will die by suicide. When we think about risk factors, first we want to think about the major risk factors. And these are things that make it even more likely that somebody may attempt or die by suicide. A big one is prior attempts. If you have a student that you know has prior attempts for suicide, you really need to keep an eye on them when they do express suicidal ideation or start to express warning signs that we'll talk about in a few minutes. As well as the misuse and abuse of alcohol or drugs. That doesn't always mean that they are depressed. There is, a fair amount of normal experimentation in adolescence, but extreme misuse or abuse of alcohol or other drugs can certainly be a major risk factor. Mental disorders, especially depression or mood disorders. When you have someone who is already struggling with a mood disorder or with depression, with anxiety, with ADHD that can lead to depression and anxiety, those are things that can be major risk factors. Having access to lethal means, if you know that they have a gun in their house, if they have a plan, if you know that they have access to prescription narcotics or whatever their plan may be, that's a definite risk factor. Knowing somebody, especially a family member that's died by suicide, especially if it's recently, can keep that sort of on the forefront and can drive that young person into a further depression and closer to a suicide attempt. Social isolation. A minute ago, I talked about being involved and having that support system. When you have someone who is isolated and they don't have a strong support system, whether it's a team or a friend group or organization or family, a supportive family, that can really sort of work against those protective factors. Chronic disease or disability, when somebody is in pain all the time or they're really struggling with other things in life because of chronic disease or disability, it can really bring about those feelings of hopelessness. And then again, the lack of access to behavioral and mental health supports. And later we will talk about, in part 2, about the knowing how to access those resources and where those community resources are. So when a student or a young person or anybody has those major risk factors, there could be a precipitating event or precipitating factor. It's really important to remember that suicide is never because of one event. It's never a one factor cause. So precipitating factors can kind of be what somebody sees as the last straw, or that hair that broke the camel's back. That's what these precipitating factors could be, because there are other risk factors or lack of protective factors. So when a student has a terrible breakup with a long-term in a long-term relationship or long-term for high school, and it feels like the end of the world, and they attempt suicide, that does not mean that it was caused by that breakup. It means that that was a precipitating factor, and there were other factors involved too. And it's important to remember that too, especially when it involves a relationship like that, a romantic relationship, because we don't want to put the blame on the person who they maybe ended a relationship with or ended a relationship with them, because then that can be a precipitating factor for that person as well. So it's important to remember that there's never just one cause, but these precipitating factors are some of the major ones: the end of a relationship, the death of a loved one, arrest or legal issues, especially for a young person who's never really been in trouble with the law before, or have been in trouble a lot. But those arrest or legal issues can seem like the end of the world and feel like they're not gonna be able to get their lives back on track. And we know that that is not the case. So, and then financial issues. The stress of family financial issues definitely have an impact on the mental health of our young people as well, because they feel their family stress. Okay, and then we have warning signs. These are signs for immediate risk. These are signs that you definitely want to have that conversation. You want to talk to their caregivers, their parents or guardians or whoever their caregivers are, if they are having these immediate risk warning signs. So when you hear someone talking about wanting to die or kill themselves, you need to let someone know. You need to either let the mental health professional in the school know, or if you're in the community, then whoever they might work with in the community or their parents. So if they're looking for a way to kill themselves, if you know that they've been searching online for obtaining a gun, if they're asking about lethal dosages of medications, if they're trying to obtain a knife or other sharp object, these can all be immediate risk situations. And then again, that feeling of hopelessness or having no reason to live and feeling like there's just no way to go on. So those are when you want to do a risk assessment immediately. Warning signs for serious risk. So there's a serious risk. It may not be imminent, but you need to have the conversation because it's serious. And you need to have that honest conversation and ask directly about, are you thinking about suicide? And name it as well, which can be a very difficult conversation to have. So, and all of the warning signs need to be taken seriously at all times. So a serious behavior, serious risk warning signs are those talking about feeling trapped, feeling like they're in pain, both physical or emotional pain, can just be absolutely unbearable, especially when a student doesn't have the coping skills or the problem solving skills to get out of the situation they're in. Talking about being a burden to others, feeling like their existence just makes other people's lives harder. It can definitely be a serious risk sign. Increased use of drugs or alcohol. Just a moment ago, I mentioned that there is a fair amount of normal experimentation among adolescents, but when you see that increased use or major misuse or abuse, that is something to be taken very seriously. Being very anxious or agitated, behaving recklessly if that is out of character for them. And really, even on the other side of that, when somebody is extraordinarily reckless and you see them starting to almost be at peace with the world, that could also be something that you want to address, any of those major behavioral changes. Sleeping too much or too little. Sometimes with teenagers, it's hard to know what is too much because they sometimes sleep more than as parents we would like them to, but the sleeping too much or too little can, if that's a change in behavior, is a definite risk sign. And then feeling isolated, withdrawn from others, that social isolation, especially if it's new. Showing a lot of rage, talking about revenge is a risk sign for suicide and harm to others, and then extreme mood swings. So those are all things to look out for and to take very seriously every time.
Yeah, Betsy, you know, as I'm listening to you read out all of these warning signs and talking about all the protective factors, it's nothing that's new to me, and it's certainly something that I've been familiar with and trained on. But even still, as I think about all the things that you have to consider and all of this information, if I am, you know, a teacher or an administrator and I don't have that training, it can be really overwhelming to try to conceptualize all of this and think about what I would do in this situation. And I think it's important, and we're going to talk about this more throughout the training. Like I said earlier, this is a shared responsibility. And that means that if you have a concern about a student, if they're showing some of these warning signs or one of the warning signs, and you just feel like something might be going on, it's not something that you have to tackle on your own. Should be something that is a collaborative support system where you have a team of folks who can talk about what's going on with the student and address the concern together. So I don't want anyone who's hearing this to feel like, okay, so now I'm responsible for, you know, screening all of my students and making sure that this is okay or that they're okay. It's a shared effort, and that means that it's also a collaborative effort. So just keep that in mind as you're hearing all of this. And we would certainly, if you have a student who you're really concerned about, you would need to let a school-based mental health professional know as soon as possible, because they would really need to be part of conversations with the student.
And it's important to note too, even if you're in the community and you hear these things in the community, you can reach out to the school and talk to those school-based mental health professionals, the counselors, the psychologists, the social workers.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, and this, I just love this graphic from the NIH. It really just sums up everything that we just talked about, and also has the information for the crisis text line and the suicide prevention hotline. So this is something you can find on the NIH website, and you can print it out, you can post it in your classrooms, you can post it in your offices, so that your students know that you are also attuned to their mental health. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Awesome. We are heading towards the end of this first section. So thank you all for staying with us. This next part, we're going to really talk about what I was kind of alluding to a moment ago. What do? You know, what if you are concerned, you see warning signs, or you start to recognize that there might be some lack of protective factors in a student's life? What is it that you do in those moments? So we're going to jump into that. So the first question is just kind of a quick self-reflection. Do you know, or what should you do if a student expresses suicidal thoughts to you? So as a teacher, for example, you hopefully have really strong relationships with your students and you make them feel safe and accepted. So it would be natural for them to disclose this to you. So you need to be prepared and know exactly what you do in that situation. How do you respond immediately? How do you make sure that you make them feel safe and heard and validated? But at the same time, how do you get them the support they need? Because if you're an educator, you haven't been trained to necessarily provide that support to them. So we need to take some steps to get them those supports. So what do you do in that moment, and how can you be prepared? And then what should you do if you have concerns about a student, or you're not necessarily sure that they're suicidal, but you're concerned that they might be? What do you do in those situations? And then, are you familiar with your school's suicide assessment procedure? Do you know how that works and what that looks like, and you know, what your part might be in that process? So the first big part of it is that asking questions. And a lot of times staff doesn't always feel comfortable asking the question, and they're not sure if that's their lane or if they should ask. And the truth is that teachers and administrators, they can initiate a conversation with the student if they have concerns and if they feel comfortable. But there's a bit of an asterisk there, or a disclosure, that even if they initiate that conversation because they have that relationship and they feel comfortable going into that conversation with the student, they need to be prepared to immediately hand that over to a trained school-based mental health professional should there be signs that there is a risk. And even if after the conversation with the student, you feel good, you feel like everything's okay, the student maybe really was dismissive of your concerns, and you walk away and you're like, okay, I don't know why I was so worried, I would still advise you strongly to consult with your school counselor, your school-based mental health professionals, because you never know what else is going on with a student, or what other teachers maybe also noticed something and confided in that school-based mental health team. And the school counselor might also be aware of, for example, that the student had actually undergone a suicide risk assessment the year before, and the year before that. They might be aware of that history. So your concerns then become a little bit more escalated and might be the reason for some follow-up from that team. So again, it's not that you can't have that conversation with the student. The student might come to you, or you might feel comfortable initiating the conversation yourself. Just be prepared to pull in your school-based mental health team in conjunction with that. All right, so like I said, I have had lots of opportunities to have these conversations with students, and every time right beforehand, you take a deep breath, and it's not an easy thing to go into. It doesn't matter how many times you do it. It's a difficult conversation to have with students because you care about them and you're concerned. So let's talk about some concrete tips for asking questions. So the first one is that you need to be direct, but also caring. So we don't want to beat around the bush on this. We don't want to pull a student into our office or into our classroom and they know that you want to ask them something. They know that there's a reason they're there, but you're kind of dragging it out and maybe not necessarily going right for what the reason is. So that can cause some anxiety and make the student uncomfortable. So it's better to just be direct with the student, but also at the same time be caring with them and let them know that they're not in trouble, that you want to you're just worried about them and you want to see if there's anything you can do to support. So that is so important, is always assuring the student they are not in trouble. I remember when I was an elementary school counselor, there was a kiddo who said something on the playground one day, and the teacher was really concerned, right? And she went into her downstairs brain, I like to call it, where she just wasn't thinking rationally because she was so concerned and afraid because of what the student said. And so she marched that student to my office and actually said to the student, "You just said something that makes me think you're going to die by suicide," and brought the student to my office. And by the time he got to me, he was just so upset and tears were streaming down his face. He was embarrassed. He thought he was in trouble. So we had to do a lot of restoring of his state of mind before we could even really go into what happened and what was said on the playground. It's really important that we do everything we can to protect students' privacy in this situation. So if you are going to ask a student about something going on in their life, make sure you do it in a private setting. And that means, maybe planning ahead or being really cognizant of where you are in your surroundings and recognizing that what you see as private might not be what the student sees as private. So if the student's body language or their eyes are letting you know that they're not feeling comfortable, maybe having this conversation in the hallway, you might be saying, "But none of these other kids are listening. I promise. They're all just walking on. Nobody's listening to us right now. They don't feel comfortable." So we have to really recognize what a private place means to students and make sure that if we're going to have the conversation, that we provide that environment so that they feel comfortable to be able to actually have an exchange with you. And so also you need to consider your relationship with the student. Are you actually the right person to talk with them? Because you might not be. Maybe if you're the student's math teacher and they're really struggling in math, it doesn't matter really how fantastic your relationship might be with them. That might be crossing into a line that they're not going to feel comfortable disclosing that with you. So just being aware, we all connect with students differently, and there's going to be some students that you have a really strong connection with and you feel like you could have this conversation with. And then there's going to be others where your gut just tells you, you know what, this kiddo and I haven't clicked on that level. I think it would actually be better if this person had the conversation instead. And then also just considering and being really transparent with yourself about your comfort level with having these conversations. If you do not feel like you have the skill set or the ability for whatever reason to have this conversation and do it well, then you should consult with the school counselor and see if they would be able to do it, or the school psychologist or the school social worker. And again, we kind of already touched on this, but it's so important to always keep your school counselor or school-based mental health team in the loop whenever you're having conversations with students around this topic. If you have a concern that causes you to feel like you need to have a conversation with the kiddo, then it's important that that team knows and they are aware of it. All right. So the next part is really kind of teasing apart, dissecting the question, right? So we're going to go beyond just asking a student, "Are you okay?" And we're going to show you a little bit what that looks like. So here's an example of what not to say. "You seem depressed." So there's a lot of reasons to not say this to a student. And this can actually do harm, which is why we went ahead and called it a bad example. Because what we're doing here is we are actually labeling a student by saying this. And this label could cause them to have a little bit of fear or anxiety. We have to really be careful about the word depressed and not using it as a synonym for sad. They're to diagnose a student with depression. So our role as a teacher or as an administrator or as a school counselor to tell a student that they fit into a category of a mental illness. Showing signs of depression also doesn't mean that a student is clinically depressed. So that's also important to keep in mind. This is another way that we could also maybe approach it, as asking, "Are you okay?" And this is okay. But I mean, most of the students that I've worked with, if I ask them, "Are you okay?" a lot of times that's a really easy answer for them. "Yeah, I'm fine." And they're going to dismiss it and they're going to move on. So this is what we would call a closed question. There's really easy for the student to just answer this with yes or no, and they're going to just move on and take the easy way out of the conversation. So here's a better way. "I have noticed some changes in you lately, and you haven't seemed like yourself. Do you want to talk?" Or you can even go further by saying, "I care about you." So starting with that, just letting the student know that this conversation is happening because I care about you and your well-being. And I've noticed some changes in you lately, like you haven't seemed like yourself, and I want to help. Do you feel comfortable telling me what's going on? Again, it's just recognizing that the student might not be comfortable. And it's an open-ended question where we're going to hopefully be able to jump into some more conversations around what's happening, what's going on. We're going to be able to draw some more information out from the student. So here's another example. I think this is helpful to kind of tease apart and look at how to not approach it and then maybe get into some of the better ways to do it. So bad, you aren't thinking about hurting yourself, are you? So this is a really tempting thing to say if you are, approaching this conversation with a student, because you really don't want it to be true. You don't want them to be thinking about hurting themselves. And so it's almost a way you feel like you're dipping your toe into the conversation by saying, you aren't thinking about hurting yourself, are you? But what we're doing here is we're being dismissive. And we're also making it feel like, oh gosh, I don't want to say yes, because they obviously, that's a bad thing if I am, and they're going to be upset with me. So this is really going to close the door on the conversation and also maybe elicit some shame in the student where they wouldn't want to open up to you or maybe any other adult because this could make them feel like they should be embarrassed about it. The next one is, okay, are you considering harming yourself? But again, this would be a very simple no from a student, and then you feel a little bit like you've hit a wall. Here's a great way to do it instead. So sometimes when people have the experiences you have had and the feelings you have, they have thoughts of suicide. Is this something you are thinking about? So it's normalizing it. It's letting them know that other people have experienced this as well. And then it's really just opening up the door to have that conversation. It's validating that they're having feelings, or it's validating that they're going through a hard time. And it's really pulling from that relationship that you've established with the student to let them know that you're there and that you want to support them. So we're going to continue to kind of go through some additional questions here. So here's one. I have noticed some changes in you since we returned from winter break. Is there something going on? Or, I know you are going through a hard time right now. Do you have someone you trust and can talk to about the way you are feeling? And then if they say yes, then you should follow up with a who. Many students go to see our school counselor when they are having experiences like this. Can I make an appointment for you? So I think this is a really important part here. It is and worthy of us pausing for a moment is this ending of this last question. Can I make an appointment for you? A lot of times if a student has never been to see their school counselor, or if they're really concerned about how that conversation might go, especially if they have confided in you and they've come to you as their teacher first, they might need you to really bridge that gap and get them directly to the hands of the school counselor. So saying, can I make an appointment for you? Or can I walk you down to their office? Or can I let the school counselor know what's going on? Or maybe you don't even ask that. You might say, I need to let the school counselor know what's going on, because if they say no, please don't, then you're kind of in a little bit of a dilemma. But I think that's really important is kind of doing that warm handoff with the counselor and helping the student and making sure that the student receives that support that they might need. So how can these questions be even more student-centered? And this is where we're going to pause for a moment and allow you to actually do what we've done. You're going to take a question here that's really not student-centered, and it's kind of missing this opportunity to get at maybe if there's something else going on with a student. You're going to take that question and you're going to revise it, and you're going to see how you can improve it so that it is a little bit more student-centered and is going to be direct and caring. So if you are watching this module or this webinar with a group, what we'd like you to do is in a moment, we're going to ask you to pause the recording, and everyone should take a second independently on their own to first kind of generate your own revisions. And then after everyone's had that chance, it's a great opportunity to have some collaborative discussions around what everyone came up with. There's more than one right way to do this. Sometimes we can learn from each other and come up with some really neat ways and engaging ways to have these conversations with students. If you're watching this on your own, you're going to simply press pause in a moment, complete the revisions on your own while focusing on the why you are changing certain elements of each question. What about that question did you feel like you needed to change, and why did you change it? So at this moment, if you are ready, you're going to hit pause and change each of these questions to more student-centered questions. And then you're going to hit play when you're ready to return so that you can hear some examples of how we revised them. All right, so welcome back. Hopefully that was a helpful opportunity and activity, and that you were able to process some questions that were well-intended perhaps, but missed the mark a little bit in engaging in what really matters with students. So here's the first question. Your grades are slipping since your dad died. I know you are sad, but I'm worried you might fail. Do you think you can start studying more? So here's a way that this could be flipped. Now, again, there's more than one right way to do this. So this is just one example of how we revised this. I read your journal entry. It made me worried about you. You are not in any trouble. So again, just letting the student know up front, they are not in trouble. Often when someone has something going on, it comes out in their writing. I just wanted to check in and see if you needed to talk. So it's direct and it's caring. Here's the next one. Do you think that your journal entry about overdosing was appropriate for school? So what we're doing here with the way that question is phrased at first is it's very much about, it's a punitive approach. It makes the student feel like they've done something wrong. So they're going to become immediately defensive and closed off. So we're not going to necessarily have the opportunity to really get at what's going on here. So instead we would ask, you've been going through so much, and I can't imagine how difficult things have been since your dad passed away. Now, granted, that means that if you have that information, you know that you have a relationship with this student and that information has been disclosed to you. So that this also speaks to just the importance of having relationships with students that are meaningful and intentional. I've noticed your grades have started to slip. What can I do to help? So again, it's not about, it's not necessarily focusing on the grades, it's focusing on the help and approaching it in a caring way. And I think the other thing to touch on here too is sometimes we don't want to mention when a tragedy has happened, like the loss of a parent, or that a student has experienced a traumatic event, or that they're going through maybe a family change. We don't always feel comfortable directly addressing that with the student because we're just worried about, do they want me to say that or not? But a lot of times what students have reported is that when no one talks about it and everyone acts like it's not happening, they feel like it's being ignored, and that their experience and what they're going through is not important. So really, by bringing that in and just letting the student know that you are aware that they're going through a hard time, you're validating their feelings and you're letting them know that this is difficult, and I recognize that. And that's just so important when we're working with students. All right, so here's the next question. If you keep posting inappropriate images about suicide on social media, I'm going to have to tell our school counselor and he will address it. So there's a lot of issues here, right? First of all, again, it's punitive, and we're putting the school counselor into a punitive role. The school counselor will address it. That's not what the school counselor is going to do. The school counselor's role is to support the student, right? It's not going to be about the inappropriate images. It's going to be about what the message is behind it and what the student is trying to communicate through those images. So I think it's really important that we pause here and we take a moment to look at the role of the school counselor and just make sure that whenever we're talking about a school counselor or a school psychologist or a school social worker and their role, that we're putting that into a role of help and of support for students, never putting them into a role where they're going to be applying a consequence or authoritarian or discipline role. So here's a different way of approaching that. A concerned student came to me and showed me some of your social media posts. You're not in trouble. Social media is a reflection of our thoughts and feelings. When other students have posted similar images to yours, it was because they were having thoughts of suicide. Is this something you are thinking about? All right. So hopefully you found that helpful, where you were able to look at some questions and rework them. And I think now what we're going to jump into is we have 3 different scenarios, and we're going to, on the next slide, I will read one of the scenarios to you. Then I'll invite you to pause the recording. If you are, again, in small groups or in a large group setting, we want you to try to process your response to the scenario independently first before discussing it as a group or as a team or as a pair. If you're watching this on your own, that is great too. But just make sure that you still do the work. So after we read the scenario, be sure to pause the recording, take some time to process each scenario, formulate a plan of action before hitting play and hearing the ways that we came up with responding. All right, so let's jump right in. Again, there's going to be 3 different scenarios. Okay, so scenario A, and I will say before I even read this, something I forgot to say on the previous slide. These are all scenarios that either Martha, Betsy, or myself experienced when we were in the field. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have had similar experiences with working with students. These are very common scenarios that you're going to be hearing about. A student writes a story where the main character dies by suicide. The character shares the same name as the student, and there are other details that allude to similarities between the student and this character. The story is detailed and realistic in its description of the death. You don't read the story until after the students have left for the day, but you have concerns for the student's safety. What should you do? I'm going to invite you to pause, ponder, and if you're able to, discuss. All right, welcome back. So here is what we came up with. And again, there are multiple ways to address this, but this is an example of how we would respond. So again, the importance of consulting with a school counselor or other mental health professional in the building is preferred. So as soon as you realize that the student has written this, you need to reach out to your school-based mental health team. If they have left the building, you can try to connect with them via phone, or also alerting your administrator of the situation might also be appropriate, because they might have some connections to either division level school-based mental health folks, or might be able to connect with one of those individuals to bring them into the conversation. So after consultation, the most likely response would be to reach out to the parent or guardian directly to share the journal entry and ensure the safety of the student. Typically, a school counselor or other school-based mental health professional would make this call. So there are going to be instances, maybe if there's suspected child abuse, or you're concerned about some of the pieces in the writing that maybe make you suspect that child abuse might be a piece of this, where you would consult with your team and really consider whether or not connecting with the parent is the right step to take. But almost in all situations, we're going to connect with that family member, that grown up, that parent, that guardian, to make sure that the student is safe if they've left our building, because that's the best way for us to take steps forward that are actionable. It's really important to also check your division policy for how to handle these situations. There might be something in writing about what steps to take if you're aware of a threat to self that happens after students have left the building. All right, so scenario B. A student comes to you and shares that they are concerned for a friend. They explain that their friend posted the images below and that she hasn't been herself after her father moved out of the house a few weeks ago. You don't know the student, but after hearing her friend's concerns, you are worried about her safety. What do you do? Again, we're going to invite you to pause, ponder, and then consult if able. All right, welcome back. So let's see what we came up with. Again, we're going to connect with a school counselor or another mental health professional in the building as soon as possible, especially because this is a student that you don't know. So you wouldn't want to be the one to breach this subject with them. That could really be alarming for the student to have an adult that they don't have a relationship with bring this conversation up. It's really important that you get in touch with that school counselor or mental health professional before students leave for the day. So we know that that can sometimes be challenging, especially if it's your last block or you have, you know, a lot of students in your classroom and you've got to figure out a way to keep them supervised, but also connect with that mental health person. And this is where having a conversation as a school staff about what your administrator would like you to do in those situations is a really important thing to do, to go ahead and have a plan for what you do if you're aware of a threat and the student isn't in your room, or you have a lot of students in your room and you aren't able to leave to go find the school counselor or school-based mental health professional. You're going to, the student that reported to you, it's really important that you let them know that they did the right thing by coming to adult and that you are really proud of them for doing that. That takes a lot of guts and a lot of bravery. Let them know that you're going to get help for their friend and ask if they would feel comfortable sharing their concerns with the school counselor or other mental health professional. It may also be necessary for the families of the reporting students to be notified as well. So as a parent, you know, if my student had come to school and experienced this and, you know, felt the need to let a school-based mental health person know or a teacher know that this was going on, I would also like to know so that I could have conversations and follow up with my student, because that could be really difficult for them. And I would want to know as their parent that this has occurred. Now, just so we're clear here, when we consult or have that conversation with the family member of the student that did the referral, we're not disclosing the identity or the name of the student that posted what they posted on social media. Granted, that student's probably going to go home and tell their grown up, but that's not our information to share. All right, scenario C. During class, you notice a student doodle some graphic illustrations of someone hanging. What do you do? Again, you're going to pause, have a conversation. Okay, welcome back. And I think it's important for me to also, this is one of the myths that a lot of folks have, is that students or individuals don't die by hanging anymore. And that is actually not true. It is one of the ways that we unfortunately lose a lot of individuals is death by hanging. And so it is something to take seriously. So if you feel comfortable and there's an opportunity to discuss this with the student privately, you should do so discreetly by pulling them aside. So this is not something that you are going to address verbally in front of the entire class. This would be a private conversation where you're going to, ask them about the illustration. Or you could alert the school counselor or other school-based mental health professional about the drawings before students are dismissed for the day, so that they can have that private conversation and follow up with students. If the drawings are distracting or disturbing to other students in the proximity to that student, you could discreetly ask the student to please put their drawing away, but then follow up with them again later. Again, that we don't want to penalize or apply any kind of consequence to the student for the drawings. We really want to make sure that our first interaction is one of support and just making sure that we know what's going on with the kiddo. So we're going to take this a little bit further. So let's say you do that. So once you're sure that you have privacy, you could ask this question. Hey, you're not in trouble right now, but I saw your drawings during class and it made me worried about you. Drawing can be how we express our thoughts and feelings. Do you want to talk? If the student is reluctant to answer, you could say, as your teacher, I care about you. If something's going on, you can talk to me, or I can help you find someone else to talk to. I just want to help. And it's really important is that after we ask questions like this, that we pause and we wait. Sometimes silence is awkward and uncomfortable, but if we try to quickly fill that silence with us talking more, sometimes we cut that student off before they're even able to answer us. So it's sometimes really tricky, but we have to be comfortable with silence and allow the student to process, think, and then respond. So this is scenario C continued. All this top part up here is still the same, but you've just asked the question in a caring and direct way, and the student responds and says, I've been really sad lately and started thinking that the world would probably be better if I wasn't in it. So now we're going to take this a step further. What do you say and what do you do? Pause and have a moment to either do some self-reflection or also talk to your teammates or fellow staff members. All right, welcome back. So the first thing we have to say here is that watch your face. If a student opens up to you like that and says something like that to you, you do not want to appear shocked or alarmed. That's going to cause the student to start to want to take back what they said and maybe even kind of close up a little bit. Instead, you want to really listen and try not to say too much right away. Just give the student 100% of your attention. When they've finished, you should calmly say, I am so glad that you shared this with me. It takes a lot of bravery to open up to someone, and I really appreciate you trusting me with this information. I care about you and I want to help you. I'm going to let your next period teacher know not to count you absent, and let's see if we can connect you with a mental health professional, or probably say the name of the person there that you're going to bring them to. He, she, they know how to help in situations like this. So again, it's staying calm, staying present, and letting the student know that they did the right thing by sharing this with you and that you're going to get them help. They're not in any trouble. All right, so we hope that this was helpful. This is just the first part. We do have part 2 that we hope that you will tune into. It's a little bit shorter than this one. At the end of part 2, there'll be the opportunity to take that quiz that Martha was sharing with you at the beginning and earn a certificate for completing this training. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again real soon.